His wife smiled. Your grandmother would love that, planting more seeds for the future. As night fell on the peaceful street, the husband thought about how far they'd come. The suspicious stares had turned to friendly waves. The hostile meetings had become community celebrations. And his grandmother's quiet act of defiance had transformed into a legacy of love. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, change never is, but it was growing, learning, and blooming in ways that would have made his grandmother proud. Sometimes the biggest victories don't come from fighting battles, but from planting gardens and waiting patiently for them to grow. 1 year later, the neighborhood had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The once empty community center now buzzed with activity as people gathered for the first anniversary of what locals called the Revelation Day. The new playground gleamed in the summer sun, complete with the curvy slide their daughter had wished for. Children of all backgrounds played together while parents chatted on newly installed benches. The community garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers, tended by the elderly botanist and a growing group of enthusiastic helpers. Remember what this place looked like a year ago? The wife asked, arranging food on tables for the celebration. Who would have thought we'd be here now? Her husband smiled, watching their daughter push a younger child on the swings. Grandma would have known. She always said time and truth were the best teachers. The clipboard woman's house was empty now. She'd moved away 6 months ago. But before leaving, she'd done something unexpected. She'd helped secure a major grant for the neighborhood youth center. Now that same house was being converted into a small library and tutoring space. The contractors are almost finished with the renovations, said the retired builder, approaching with blueprint updates. We're on track to open the library next month. Oh, and the after-school program already has 20 kids signed up. Their daughter ran up, breathless with excitement. Dad, we found something in the garden. The old man says it's from a long time ago. She led them to where the elderly botanist stood holding a tarnished metal box. He'd discovered it while preparing a new flower bed. I believe this belongs to your family, he said, handing over the box. Inside, they found more of his grandmother's papers, perfectly preserved. But these were different. They were her dreams for the neighborhood's future, sketched out in careful detail. A playground, a garden, a library, almost exactly what they had built. She didn't just plan for property ownership, the husband said softly, touching the old papers. She planned for community. The celebration grew livelier as more neighbors arrived, each bringing food and stories to share. The potluck table represented cuisines from around the world, a far cry from the days when diversity was seen as a threat. An older resident who'd lived there since his grandmother's time took the microphone. A year ago, we learned that one wise woman had outsmarted decades of prejudice. But she did more than that. She gave us a chance to be better than our past. The wife squeezed her husband's hand as their daughter played with her friends on the new playground equipment. The sound of children's laughter mixed with adults' conversations in various languages filled the air. Your grandmother, the elderly botanist said, joining them with a plate of food, she planted more than just rose bushes. She planted hope, and look how it's bloomed. Later that evening, as families began heading home, their daughter collected flowers from the community garden, a tradition that had started when the first blooms appeared. Can we put these on great-grandma's picture? She asked. At home, they placed the flowers beneath the portrait of his grandmother that now hung proudly in their living room. The house felt different now, not just their home, but part of something bigger. The husband found one last document in the metal box, a letter dated just months before his grandmother passed away. To whoever finds this, it read, remember that change doesn't come from fighting hatred with hatred. It comes from planting seeds of love and waiting patiently for them to grow. I bought these houses not to own them, but to give them purpose. May they always serve as bridges between people, not walls. Outside, porch lights twinkled up and down the street. Music drifted from someone's backyard party. Children's bikes lay scattered on front lawns, their owners too tired from playing to put them away. You know what's funny? The wife said as they sat on their porch swing. A year ago, we thought this was just about property ownership. But your grandmother knew better. She wasn't buying houses, she was buying hope. Their daughter had fallen asleep between them, still clutching a flower from the garden. Next week's community meeting, he said, I want to propose something. What if we use some of the rental income to start a scholarship fund? Help more families own homes here. The community center looked different this time. Instead of hostile faces and legal papers, there were coffee cups, cookies, and roughly 30 neighbors seated in a circle. 2 weeks had passed since the revelation about the property ownership, and this was the first official neighborhood meeting under the new reality. The husband stood at the front, his wife beside him. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Today isn't about the past. It's about our future as a community." A middle-aged man raised his hand. "I've lived here for 15 years, he said, his voice shaking slightly. "All this time, I've been paying rent to your grandmother's company. She never raised the rent, not once. Even when other neighborhoods got more expensive, she kept it fair." "That's because she believed in building community, not just owning property," the husband replied. "And that's why we're here today." He unrolled a large blueprint on the table. "These are plans for renovating the playground behind the community center. Right now, it's just rusty swings and broken benches. We can make it better." The room grew quiet as people studied the plans. A young mother spoke up, her baby asleep in her arms. "But that would be expensive. Who's going to pay for it?" "We are," the wife answered. "All the rental income from these properties. We're putting it back into the neighborhood, just like his grandmother did." Their daughter, sitting in the front row, raised her hand high. "Can we have a slide?" A big curvy one. Laughter broke the tension. Suddenly, people were talking over each other, suggesting additions to the playground plans. "What about a garden?" an elderly resident suggested. "I used to teach botany. I could help maintain it." The clipboard woman, who had been silent until now, cleared her throat. Everyone turned to look at her. She paused, clearly struggling. "I have experience writing grant proposals. If you need help getting additional funding for the playground, I'd like to help." The husband met her eyes and nodded. "We'd appreciate that." As the meeting continued, more people began sharing ideas. The high school teacher offered to start a weekend tutoring program. A retired contractor volunteered to inspect the houses for needed repairs. Someone suggested starting a neighborhood newsletter. Their daughter tugged at her father's sleeve. "Dad, can I tell them my idea?" He lifted her up so everyone could see her. "Go ahead, sweetheart." "What if we had a big party? Like, with food from everybody's families, so we can all be friends?" The room went quiet again, but this time it was different. The wife saw tears in several people's eyes. "Out of the mouths of babes," the elderly botanist said softly. "That's exactly what we need." Later that evening, as people lingered over coffee and cookies, small groups formed to discuss different projects. The clipboard woman was deep in conversation with the wife about grant applications. The contractor and the husband were reviewing repair priorities for the rental properties. Their daughter had fallen asleep on a chair, her sketch of the dream playground clutched in her hand. A rainbow-colored swing set, a garden full of flowers, and stick figures of all colors holding hands. "You know what's amazing?" The wife whispered to her husband. 2 weeks ago, these same people were trying to evict us. Now they're planning a community garden together. He smiled, watching the elderly botanist explaining different plant options to an excited group. That's what Grandma meant in her letter. About building something beautiful. As they drove home that evening, the street looked different. Porch lights were on, welcoming rather than watching. Someone had already started pulling weeds from the future garden spot. Their daughter woke up briefly as they carried her inside. "Dad, are we really going to have the best playground ever?" "Even better than that," he said, tucking her in. "We're going to have the best neighborhood ever." After she fell asleep, the couple sat on their porch, a tradition they'd kept despite everything. The night was quiet, but now it was a peaceful quiet. "Your grandmother," the wife said softly, "she didn't just buy houses, did she? She bought time. Time for people to learn to be better." Her husband nodded, looking at the stars. "She used to say that change doesn't happen in big moments. It happens in small choices, day by day." Down the street, the clipboard woman's porch light was on, and for the first time since they'd moved in, it felt like an invitation rather than a surveillance tactic. The future was taking shape, one small choice at a time. The morning after the community center showdown, the neighborhood felt different. The usual morning dog walkers crossed the street to avoid passing the family's house, but this time out of embarrassment rather than prejudice. The husband sat at his grandmother's desk, spreading out the local newspaper. There on the front page was the story: Historic Property Revelation Shakes Local Community. Below it, a photo of his grandmother from the 1960s, standing proudly in front of the corner house. "Look at this," his wife said, scrolling through her phone. "People are sharing the story everywhere. Your grandmother's story is inspiring others to speak up about their own experiences." Their daughter burst into the study, waving a piece of paper. "Dad, someone put this in our mailbox." It was a handwritten letter from the elderly couple 3 houses down. "We've lived here for 40 years, it read. "We always wondered why our rent checks went to different companies. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. We should have spoken up sooner about how you were being treated. We're sorry." Throughout the day, more letters arrived. Some were apologies, others were stories about interactions with his grandmother years ago. One older resident remembered her as the kind secretary who helped him understand his lease agreement back in 1972. The phone rang. It was a local TV station wanting to do a feature story. "They'd want to know if we'll share Grandma's documents," his wife said, covering the phone's microphone. "They say it's important history." "Tell them yes," he replied, looking at his grandmother's old photos. "People need to know this story." That afternoon, a small crowd gathered outside their house. The husband tensed until he saw they were carrying plates of food and handwritten notes. "We were wrong," said a woman who'd lived on the block for 20 years. "I never questioned why half of us rented from different companies. Your grandmother was brilliant." The clipboard woman wasn't among the visitors, but her teenage son stopped by. "Mom's really upset," he admitted. "But Dad said what your grandmother did was genius. He said it's making him rethink everything." Inside, the husband pulled out more of his grandmother's records. Bank statements showing decades of careful saving. Letters between her and her white colleague who helped her buy the properties. Newspaper clippings about housing discrimination from the 1960s. "She kept everything," he told the TV reporter who came by later. She knew someday these papers would tell an important story. The reporter studied the documents with growing amazement. "This isn't just about property ownership," she said. "This is about how one woman outsmarted a system designed to keep her out." Their daughter sat at her grandmother's desk, carefully touching the old papers. "Dad, were people really that mean to Grandma?" He sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. "People were unfair to her, yes. But instead of getting angry, she got smart. She found a way to change things for the future, for you." As evening fell, the family sat on their porch, watching the sunset. The usual surveillance cars were gone. Instead, a few neighbors waved as they walked by. The wife checked her phone again. "The story's everywhere now. People are calling your grandmother a civil rights pioneer." "She never wanted that kind of attention," her husband said softly. "She just wanted to make sure her family had a place where they truly belonged." A young couple stopped at their gate, looking nervous. "We rent the blue house down the street," they said. "We had no idea. We just wanted to say, we're glad you're here." Later that night, as their daughter slept upstairs, the couple looked through more of his grandmother's papers. They'd found a letter she'd written years ago, never sent. "To my future family," it began. "If you're reading this, then the truth has finally come out. Remember that I didn't do this to shame anyone. I did it to show that sometimes the best response to hatred is to quietly build something beautiful. Take care of these houses, but more importantly, take care of the hope they represent." The husband wiped his eyes. She knew this day would come. His wife squeezed his hand. "And she made sure you'd be ready for it." Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet now, not the tense silence of hostility, but the peaceful quiet of a place where truth had finally come to light. The old houses stood as they always had, but now their history was known. They weren't just buildings anymore. They were monuments to one woman's courage, wisdom, and extraordinary vision for the future. The community center buzzed with tension as neighbors filed in for the emergency homeowners meeting. The clipboard woman stood at the front, a stack of papers clutched to her chest, while the expensive suited lawyer arranged documents on a folding table. "I can't believe they had the nerve to show up," someone whispered loudly as the family walked in. The husband guided his wife and daughter to seats in the front row, his grandmother's worn leather briefcase held firmly in his hand. The clipboard woman tapped the microphone. We've called this emergency meeting to address serious concerns about unauthorized occupancy in our prestigious neighborhood. She emphasized each word as if reading from a script she'd practiced in front of her mirror. The lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. As your legal counsel, I've prepared eviction notices based on multiple violations of community guidelines and questions about the legitimacy of these people's residency. The husband felt his wife's hand tighten around his. Their daughter, sensing the hostility in the room, pressed closer to her mother's side. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, we have evidence suggesting fraudulent claims to property ownership. No one in this family could possibly have the means to purchase a home in this neighborhood legitimately. The husband stood slowly, his grandmother's briefcase still in his hand. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. Before you continue, he said calmly, I'd like to ask a question. How many of you actually own your homes? Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. The clipboard woman's face reddened. What kind of question is that? We all own our homes. Well, except for the Millers, who rent from some investment company. Actually, another neighbor piped up, we rent too, from a property management group. More voices joined in, revealing that nearly half the residents were renters, all paying to different companies with various official-sounding names. The husband opened his grandmother's briefcase, removing a stack of carefully preserved documents. Those companies, they're all owned by my grandmother's estate. And now they belong to me. He laid out deed after deed on the folding table. Each one bore his grandmother's name, dating back to the 1960s. The lawyer's hands trembled as he examined them. This is impossible, the clipboard woman sputtered. Your grandmother? But that would mean, the husband continued quietly, that many of you have been paying rent to a black woman's estate for years. The same black family you're trying to evict actually owns not just one house, but the entire block. The silence in the room was deafening. Someone dropped a water bottle, the plastic clattering against the floor like a gunshot. My grandmother bought these properties one by one, working through white intermediaries because she knew she'd face exactly this kind of discrimination if she tried to buy them directly. She was a secretary at a law firm, saving every penny, planning for a future where her family could live wherever they chose. His daughter tugged at his sleeve. Dad, does this mean we own the pool too? A few nervous laughs broke the tension. The lawyer was frantically flipping through the deeds, his face growing paler by the minute. These are all legitimate, he stammered. The titles are clear. The ownership is absolute. The clipboard woman collapsed into a chair, her precious papers scattered across the floor. Other neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Now, the husband said, his voice firm but not unkind. I think it's time we had a real discussion about community guidelines, starting with the true meaning of the word community. He looked around the room, meeting hostile, shocked, and even a few shank-faced expressions. My grandmother didn't buy these properties for revenge. She bought them as an investment in change, in hope. She believed that someday this neighborhood could be a place where everyone was welcome, regardless of their color. His wife stood beside him, their daughter between them. We're not going anywhere, she added. But we're happy to work together with anyone who's willing to build a better community. One without fake violations and emergency meetings about unauthorized occupancy. As people began filing out of the community center, some red-faced, others deep in thought, the husband carefully repacked his grandmother's briefcase. The clipboard woman lingered by the door, her clipboard conspicuously absent. The pool opens at 10 tomorrow, he called out to her retreating back. Everyone's welcome, even the unauthorized residents. His daughter looked up at him. Did we win, Dad? He hugged her close. No, sweetheart. We just opened the door for something better than winning. We opened the door for change. The summer heat wasn't the only thing making temperatures rise in the neighborhood. 3 weeks after moving in, the family's mailbox was overflowing with official-looking envelopes from the Homeowners Association. Another one? The wife asked, sorting through the mail at their kitchen counter. That's the third notice this week. Now they're complaining about our grass being half an inch too tall. Her husband was reviewing the latest complaint on his laptop. They've hired a lawyer, he said, his voice calm but concerned. Apparently, our bird feeder violates Section 7, Paragraph 3 of neighborhood guidelines that were written yesterday. Their daughter wandered in from the backyard, her expression troubled. Dad, can I still go to the pool? The parents shared a look. Earlier that week, other children had mysteriously exited the community pool right after their daughter entered. The next day, a new sign appeared, pool closed for maintenance. Yet neighbors were still swimming. Maybe we'll set up a sprinkler in the backyard instead, her mother suggested, trying to keep her voice light. We can invite your cousins over. Oh, that might be a problem, her husband said, holding up another notice. According to this, we need approval for any gathering of more than 3 people. They're concerned about parking issues. At the local grocery store, the wife noticed how other shoppers would switch aisles when she entered. One morning, she overheard 2 neighbors talking near the cereal aisle. Did you see their curtains? They're not beige. The guidelines clearly state all street-facing windows must have beige curtains. Well, I heard they're probably just renting. No way they could afford to buy in this neighborhood. My husband's looking into their financial history. The wife gripped her shopping cart tighter, remembering her mother-in-law's words. Hold your head high. Your dignity is not determined by their prejudice. Back home, their daughter was becoming more aware of the tension. Mom, why did Mrs. Next Door tell her kids they can't play with me? The mother sat down with her child, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes people make wrong choices based on fear of what they don't understand. But that's their loss, sweetheart. You keep being your wonderful self. That evening, a group of neighbors gathered across the street, not even trying to hide their suspicious glances. The clipboard woman was there, along with a man in an expensive suit who kept pointing at their house while talking on his phone. They've hired private investigators, the husband said, going through more papers at his grandmother's old desk. They're trying to find anything they can use against us: parking tickets, credit history, school records. His wife joined him in the study, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. Should we tell them about the deeds yet? He shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. Not yet. Let's see how far they're willing to go with this. My grandmother always said, sometimes you have to let people walk themselves right into their own lesson. The next morning, they found their newspaper in the bushes, completely soaked despite the clear weather. Their daughter's bike had mysteriously gotten a flat tire, and someone had reported their car as suspicious to the local police. They're getting bolder, the wife observed, watching through the window as neighbors took photos of their house from different angles. What are they hoping to find? Her husband was reviewing his grandmother's old documents, a thoughtful expression on his face. They're looking for proof that we don't belong here. But all they're really doing is proving why change in this neighborhood is long overdue. That night, as the family sat down for dinner, another certified letter arrived. This one was from a law firm requesting proof of their right to occupancy within 48 hours. The husband carefully placed the letter in his grandmother's filing cabinet, right next to the property deeds that would soon turn their neighbor's world upside down. You know what's ironic? He told his wife as their daughter set the table. They're so busy trying to force us out, they haven't even wondered who their rent checks have been going to all these years. His wife smiled, understanding in her eyes. Sometimes the best response to ignorance is patience. As the sun set on another tense day, the family sat on their porch, deliberately visible, deliberately at peace. Let the neighbors take their pictures. Let them write their letters. The truth would come out soon enough, and it would be worth every moment of their wait. The moving truck pulled away from the curb as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. The new family had just finished bringing in their last box when the doorbell rang. That's odd, the wife said, wiping dust from her hands. We haven't even been here 2 hours. Her husband opened the door to find a woman with perfectly styled hair standing on their porch, clutching a clipboard. Behind her stood 3 other neighbors, their forced smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Welcome to the neighborhood, the clipboard woman said, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes sharp as tacks. We're the Neighborhood Welcoming Committee. We like to make sure all new residents understand our community standards. The husband noticed how she emphasized the word residents, as if questioning their very right to be there. His grandmother's quiet strength echoed in his mind as he maintained his composure. That's thoughtful of you, he replied smoothly. We're still unpacking, but maybe we could schedule a proper meeting later this week. The clipboard woman's smile tightened. Oh, we really should discuss a few things now. You see, we have very specific guidelines about property maintenance, noise levels, and... She paused, glancing at their moving boxes, the types of gatherings permitted. Just then, their young daughter came running to the door, her favorite stuffed giraffe in hand. Daddy, can we set up my room now? The clipboard woman's expression flickered at the sight of the child, but she quickly recovered. Oh, how nice. Will there be many children visiting? We've had some issues with noise complaints in the past. Our daughter's pretty quiet, the wife said, stepping forward. She's more interested in her books than making noise. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a lot of unpacking to do. Later that evening, as the family ate takeout pizza on boxes serving as makeshift furniture, they watched through their window as the clipboard woman led a group of neighbors in what appeared to be an impromptu street meeting. Look at them out there, the wife sighed, planning their next move like this is some kind of chess game. Her husband smiled, thinking of the property deeds safely stored in his grandmother's old leather briefcase. Let them play their games. We've got more important things to focus on. Over the next few days, the welcoming committee seemed to multiply. Neighbors walked their dogs past the house with suspicious frequency. Cars slowed down as they drove by. Someone was always watching, always taking notes. Did you see Mrs. Clipboard taking pictures of our rose bushes this morning? The wife asked over breakfast. Apparently, they're not regulation height. Her husband chuckled. Well, those bushes have been here since my grandmother planted them in 1965. I guess they're historic violations. The daughter looked up from her cereal. Why do they keep watching our house, Mom? Did we do something wrong? The parents exchanged glances, their hearts heavy with the weight of explaining prejudice to a child. No, sweetheart, the mother said gently. Sometimes people are scared of change, even when that change is good. That afternoon, a formal letter arrived from the Neighborhood Association, an organization they'd never heard of before. It listed 23 alleged violations, from unauthorized shade of white paint to non-standard mailbox height. The husband placed the letter in his grandmother's old filing cabinet right next to her carefully preserved property deeds. You know what's funny? He told his wife. They're so busy trying to find reasons we don't belong here, they haven't even realized whose block they're really living on. His wife squeezed his hand. Should we tell them? Not yet, he replied, watching another neighbor slow walk past their window, phone camera not so subtly raised. Sometimes the best response to pettiness is patience. My grandmother taught me that. As the sun set on another day of surveillance and subtle harassment, the family sat on their porch, deliberately visible, deliberately at peace. Their daughter practiced her reading, sounding out words from her favorite book, while her parents shared knowing smiles. Let the clipboard brigade plot and plan. Let them take their photos and write their letters. Sometimes the sweetest victory is the one that comes after letting others show exactly who they are. The old brick house stood proudly at the corner of Oak Street, its weathered facade telling stories of decades gone by. Inside, a young black businessman was carefully going through dusty boxes in his grandmother's study. His fingers trembled as he opened an envelope marked Property Records, 1960 to 1975. Son, his father's voice was soft with emotion. Your grandma wanted you to have these after she passed. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. She always said you had her spirit for building something meaningful. The papers inside revealed an incredible truth. His grandmother, a quiet but determined woman who had worked as a secretary in a law firm, had done something extraordinary. Back in the 1960s, when most neighborhoods were strictly segregated, she had developed a brilliant plan. Working with Mr. Richardson, a sympathetic white colleague from her law firm, she had gradually purchased properties along the entire block. One house at a time, year after year, she built her legacy in silence. Mr. Richardson would buy the properties on paper, then legally transfer them to her through a complex series of business arrangements. I remember how she'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, going over these documents his father shared, picking up an old leather ledger. She kept track of every penny, every transaction. Back then, a black woman buying property in this neighborhood. People would have done everything to stop her. The young man's eyes widened as he realized the full scope of his inheritance. The entire block, 12 houses in total, now belonged to him. His grandmother hadn't just bought properties, she'd secured a future for her family in a neighborhood that had once tried to keep them out. Looking through old photographs, he found one of his grandmother standing in front of the corner house, her expression serious but her eyes twinkling with quiet triumph. On the back, in her neat handwriting, was written, "Our beginning, 1963. You know what made your grandma special?" His father asked, straightening a frame on the wall. "She never acted out of anger or revenge. She used to say, 'They can keep us out of their neighborhoods, but they can't stop us from building our own future.'" As evening settled over the neighborhood, the young man stood on the porch of what would now be his family's home. The largest house on the block, it had been his grandmother's pride and joy. He thought about the other properties, some rented out, others in need of renovation. He saw not just buildings, but opportunities to honor his grandmother's vision. His wife joined him on the porch, their young daughter in her arms. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "About how one person's quiet determination can change the future," he replied, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Grandma didn't just buy houses, she bought possibilities. Now it's our turn to build on that." Inside the house, boxes waited to be unpacked. Tomorrow, they would begin their new life here. His grandmother's old desk still stood in the study, its surface worn smooth by years of careful planning. On it, he placed the folder of property records and her leather ledger, reminders of how patience and wisdom could overcome the tallest barriers. "We'll make you proud, Grandma," he whispered to the quiet room. "We'll make this block everything you dreamed it could be."